I wanted to make myself a circle cutting jig for the router for quite a while now, and I wanted to make something a lot more refined and longer lasting than just a stick with a nail in it. I had this spare router that I could dedicate to the jig, but because we're in lockdown, I had to use what I already had lying around, and that was 12mm MDF. But I didn't want to sacrifice 12mm of bit travel on the router. So looking at the base, I saw these raised sections of the post supports and thought to myself that they weren't really needed. So I cut them off, which gave me back that extra plunge depth. Worked like a charm. The jig is fairly simple to build. I first cut the base out of 12mm MDF, and then using the original router base plate, I drilled the mounting holes towards one end. I needed to countersink the holes so the screw heads would be flush, so I used an 8mm brad point bit and drilled to a depth of 4mm. And then drilled the screw holes all the way through. With the router mounted on the base, I used a V-bit to mark where the centre of the router was. I then used that mark to draw a centre line along the base, and I could reference off that to cut the groove for the sliding arm that will have the pivot pin in it. As the build went on, I ended up extending that cutout right up to the edge of the router base. Next, I ripped down a piece of hardwood for the sliding arm and used a hand plane to get it down to the right width and thickness. Next step was to glue a cover piece over the channel for the sliding arm to stiffen up the base, particularly at the open end, and also for a groove to be cut into for the locking screw to lock the sliding arm in place. I cut the pivot pin from this length of 5mm stainless steel rod I had. And installed it into a 5mm hole drilled into the sliding arm. The pin is just a friction fit. At the other end of the sliding arm, I needed to install a T-nut for a locking screw. To prevent any possible splitting of this piece when installing the T-nut, I drilled small pilot holes for the T-nut spikes. Next job was to route the groove in the base for the locking screw that will allow the sliding arm to be fixed at any radius, within the limits of the jig that is. I then chamfered the top edge of the groove to smooth it out. And this is how it goes together. The sliding arm can be used in both directions, so you get the full range of radii, either with the pivot pin further away from the router or turned around so it's closer to the router. Last thing to do was to cut the tapers on the jig just to give it a better look. To do that, I simply ripped down a piece of scrap wider than the jig, and without moving the table saw fence, I screwed the jig down to that piece, lining up the taper with the edge, and ran it through the saw. To finish it off, I first gave it a coat of primer sealer. And then, realising I hadn't yet cut the hole in the jig for the router bit to pass through, I used a hole saw to cut that once the paint had dried. And then finished it off with a few coats of workshop grey. First test run. And it worked exactly as intended. Very happy.